Hello, everyone. Welcome to PIEL UK 2021 conference and to the panel on equality with a question on what can environmental law do to better safeguard and mitigate against inequalities and injustice. Before introducing to you the moderator of this panel, Thimali Kodikara, I would like to thank every one of you, both panelists and attendees, for being here today with us. Thimali hails from London, but has lived in Brooklyn, where she produces the Dog Society's podcast, Mothers of Invention, which explores feminist solutions to climate change from around the world. She has also worked at Getty Images and Christie's, but now focuses on understanding how women around the world are grappling with the dramatically heating planet, having talked to so many who are on the front lines of the fast-moving climate crisis. And after that, Thimali, I give the floor to you in order to introduce the other panelists and to deliver your speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eliana. I appreciate that nice introduction. Welcome, everybody. First things first, yes, my name is Thimali Kodikara, and I'd firstly like to acknowledge the indigenous lands of the Lenape-Hoking peoples, whose colonized land I'm speaking to you from, which is now known as Brooklyn, New York. As Eliana mentioned, I'm the series producer and co-host of a podcast called Mothers of Invention, which I co-host with Mary Robinson, who was formerly the president of Ireland, and a comedian, Maeve Higgins. And we talk to mostly Black and Brown and Indigenous women and girls all over the world who are on their solutions to the climate crisis, because who better to ask than people who are existing on the front lines of the crisis, but also surviving it, finding innovative ways to survive it too. So today, however, I'm here to present or host for you this fantastic panel on safeguarding and mitigating against inequalities and injustices. Because, of course, in 2020, we saw all this overdue attention drawn to the Black Lives Matter movement and systemic racism that, of course, plagues our society. So in today's panel, we're going to try and pry that open, what environmental law can do to better do this for us, and how the sector can and must rally to ensure effective change. So we have a fantastic lineup, as you all know, but the broad scope of the question that we're posing to the guests today are going to give us a broad realm of insights into clean air, urban planning, access to nature, the relationships between law, policy, and activism, and how we can create a more inclusive and intersectional environmental sector, because obviously there have been a lot of issues around that for a long time. So first things first, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Gita Parihar. If you want to give us a wave, Gita. Hi, Gita. Anita Okunde. Hi, Anita. Julian Agyeman. And Consolata U Bosa Enobakhare. I got there in the end, Consolata, just about. You can grill me at the end, I promise. So we're going to hear presentations from each of them in that order, but I'd like to do some brief intros first. So Gita Parihar is a lawyer with expertise in environmental and human rights issues. She is formerly head of legal at Friends of the Earth, where she was shortlisted for In-House Lawyer of the Year. And she now works as an in-house consultant for NGOs leading legal campaigns. She's also a trustee of the Climate Justice Fund, which has been set up to support legal climate initiatives predominantly in the Global South. So very happy to have her here. Anita is a 16-year-old award-winning activist and public speaker focusing on intersectional climate justice and feminism. Anita's work is focused on putting those disproportionately affected by the climate crisis at the forefront of the movement, particularly BIPOC people. And she has set up press conferences, taken up space in white-dominated areas of climate activism, and spoken out against environmental classism. I'm really glad we've got youth represented on this panel, because it's all about you guys. So very happy to have you here, Anita. Julian is Professor of Urban Environmental Planning, Professor of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University in Massachusetts. and he has extensive experience in local government, environmental and sustainability consulting, and in the voluntary sector in the UK. And he holds a PhD in urban studies from the University of London, an MA in conservation policy from Middlesex University in the UK, and a BSc in geography and botany from Durham University, UK. It's putting us all to shame. Thank you, Julian. And Consolata is an LLM qualified legal researcher and a yoga teacher. And she was a Phil Michael Scholar working with the legal team at Friends of the Earth on landmark public interest litigation cases such as the Supreme Court Heathrow case, which is critical. And now she conducts research on environmental law and litigation, climate justice, and sustainable development. So in her outreach and activism work, she's speaking to university students, grassroots organizations, and NGOs about the power of a truly transformative environmental justice movement that sees the rights and solutions pioneered by the most affected people and areas at the forefront. So I'm so happy to have you all here. We're going to do a nice Q&A after we've heard each of the presentations back to back. So I hope everybody listening has pens ready, because we'll be taking your questions right after. So I'd love to welcome Gita up first. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thimali. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about climate justice and equality and the law, and there will be some actual law in this presentation, but I'm also going to be talking a bit about some of the story about how we got here, which I think is really important in understanding where we've got to now, and also where we might need to perhaps retrace or reflect on some steps before moving forward. I should say also that this presentation is my own personal views rather than any organizations I have worked for or I am working for. So I'm going to zoom back now to the 17th century, and a book written by an ecofeminist called Caroline Merchant in 1990 called The Death of Nature. And in this book, she identifies nature as having traditionally been viewed as feminine in both Western and non-Western cultures right up until the 17th century in Europe. And in Europe at that time, she was seen both as a nurturing mother, but also as wild and uncontrollable. And Caroline Merchant views women also as having been seen in the same way. And she traces that around this time, there was a rise in market-oriented culture and in an approach to nature which involved experimentation and extraction. And she also argues that this was not only something that happened to nature in itself, but it also happened to women. So this was the time that the witch trials were taking place, and people who had nature connection or who were herbalists or shamans, and often who were women, midwives, had particular kinds of esoteric knowledge, were killed for that knowledge. So these two things, she points out, happened at roughly the same time. And this began an era, actually, of subjugation and othering, where certain people were viewed as being distinct and inferior, which then carried on into colonialism. So once you began that extractive process of extracting from land and othering people, that got taken abroad. And that this is also something that I was interested listening to James Gatti, who's a professor of law at Chicago Law School, and he was explaining how international law at the time also worked within these sort of processes of going abroad and colonialism, and that there was a law of hospitality which decreed a European law principle that you were entitled to hospitality in another land, and if you didn't get it, you could conquer them, which is quite astounding, actually, but does really represent the mindset that took place at that time, that existed at that time, with this expectation that everything else was out there for being conquered, essentially. And a lot of that initial engagement with what became future colonies was commercially related. So, for example, with the East India Company, that was formed to trade with the Indian region and beyond, and ended up taking control of it. So we can see from the very beginning, in terms of the industrialization of Europe, that went hand in hand with colonialism and extractivism. And of course, we now know that industrialization onwards led to the climate crisis that we're now seeing. And in broad terms, industrial countries, which have about 20% of the global population, are responsible for around 80% of the emissions that we see. And this injustice and the colonialism and extractivism that I've just been speaking about have been compounded by the fact that the impacts of climate change, as I'm sure many of us know, are unequal. They are felt more deeply in the global south, and they are affecting the global south first. And these include things like increasing heat stress, poor air quality, poor drinking water quality, heat waves, wildfires, migrants moving from the towns to the cities, irregular rainfall patterns impacting on crops, and increased disease, sea surges, salinization in the Pacific Islands, for example, which is having impacts on water quality, all of which is being compounded by the pandemic, because many of those communities are also the ones who are being hardest hit by COVID. And many of these communities also are communities of color, including in developed countries, but this talk is particularly focusing on the global aspect of climate justice. So climate change and climate justice is an intersectional issue, because you have issues of race and gender and economic and social inequalities, which are being compounded by climate change, and now also by the pandemic that we're seeing. And of course, that pandemic comes from human incursions into nature, which wouldn't normally happen, and then you end up with viruses leaping. So all of these various issues are creating, in some ways, a vicious circle. But it did seem worth flagging that we haven't just got here overnight. This is where we find ourselves now, is the result of 5 centuries of a particular approach, which is why I would say it's taking quite a while to unpack. And I think when I come to talk about solutions, it does reflect some of what I'm going to say about what the solutions or what the ways forward might be. Now I'm going to look at whether there are existing principles in international law that help deal with some of these kinds of injustices. And the first principle I want to talk about is the principle of equity. And that is reflected through an international environmental law principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which recognizes that though environmental problems are global, developed countries have a particular responsibility to take action because they've used more of our planet's resources and they have a bigger capacity to take action. And this principle is included in both the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement. And there's a lot of debate about how it should be applied, but it has remained a very kind of key framework principle. And another article I particularly wanted to talk about, another part of the international environmental framework, is part of the Paris Agreement, Article 8 of that agreement, which deals with loss and damage. So this was a recognition that as well as taking action to mitigate climate change and adapt climate change, there were now certain kinds of climate change that could not be adapted to. And that was as a result of failure to take action by developed countries in sufficient time. So this provides for things like finance and capacity building and technology transfer. But at the earlier stages of negotiations for this article, the least developed countries were calling for it to also provide for compensation and redress for some of the harm that had been caused. And this was a massively contentious issue. And not only was that not referred to, but as a result of pressure from countries like the US, there's a decision that goes along with the Paris Agreement that says that Article 8 does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. And it's important to note here that the kind of losses we're talking about are not only economic loss, and in fact, some of the most fundamental losses are not ones that really fit monetary valuing. So it's things like losses of place of worship and folklore and medicine grounds, and many Pacific islands, for example, have an oral culture, and that's passed on from generation to generation. And then that can have impacts on cultural ties if you lose that culture, and religious rights and other forms of knowledge, many of which are actually crucial for us to be, as a broader global community, to be able to understand and reconnect with as a kind of symbol of what has been lost more broadly and what may be needed to be reconnected with in order for us to come off the very dangerous course that we're currently on as a planet. A lot of these kinds of rights are protected through human rights obligations, for example, cultural rights. There's also the right to life and shelter and many other human rights that bear upon action on climate change, on an environmental law more broadly, on environmental harms more broadly. The Paris Agreement refers to human rights obligations, and there's also a UN rapporteur on human rights and the environment, for example. So there's quite a lot of work going on exploring the interlinkages there. I wanted to also talk about a couple of areas where there's some quite significant gaps. One is around climate displacement. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of climate displacement happening, a lot of people having to flee their homes, and this will only get worse as there will be, they're looking to be entire islands that are going to go underwater if we carry on as we are at the moment, and yet there is no legal framework in place to protect them. UN Convention on Refugees doesn't specifically protect climate refugees or environmental refugees. There are some interesting developments happening in other ways. For example, last year in January 2020, the UN Human Rights Committee made a finding that countries shouldn't deport individuals who face climate change induced harm that violate their rights to life. But that's a very individual level decision. And as I mentioned before, we're talking here about communities and nations and recognition of issues like non-economic loss and cultural rights. And there's really no framework to deal with that. Another area where there's a very big gap is around protection of environmental defenders. And there are a record number of environmental defenders killed last year. There's increasing intimidation and violence of people who stand up to protect their territories. And a very large proportion of these can be indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples' territories hold 80% of the world's biodiversity, and they're often very intimately connected with some of the key areas that exist of planetary survival, like the Amazon, for example. And they're also doubly impacted because of things like COVID-19, which are creating risks to health, as well as the risks that they're facing from attacks from mining, logging interests, tourism. Environmental defenders can also be lawyers or journalists or NGO staffs. But at the moment, there are very many people who, in trying to protect their environments, are literally taking their lives in their hands. So when we're talking about solutions to these kinds of harms and injustices, it's very important to uplift the voices of people who are on the front lines. And responsibility needs to be allocated in a fair way between rich and poor countries, and based along lines of responsibility. And it's also very important not to create solutions which exacerbate existing inequalities within countries also. The Climate Equity Reference Project has developed an online calculator which looks at fair shares of what actions countries should be taking based on their historical emissions. And most developed countries are in negative emissions territory, which means that they need to be supporting developing countries to take action. There's a lot of interesting environmental litigation that's also going on out there. I'm not going to cover the entire range of cases, and I'm sure they'll come up later, but one I wanted to focus on was the case of Leluya versus RWE. And this is a case against the German power company, RWE, by a Peruvian farmer. There was a research several years ago that showed that about 100 companies globally are responsible for about 70% of the emissions that we see. And this case involved a glacier nearby Mr. Leluya's village, which is melting. And he is arguing that as one of the companies primarily responsible or listed for this kind of global greenhouse gas emissions harm that we're seeing, that RWE was required to help support financially the action needed to secure the village. So it's a case being argued on the principal point at the moment about this, and the court has recognised, so far it's still ongoing litigation, but it's recognised that a private company could potentially be held liable for the climate change related damages of greenhouse gas emissions. There is also some interesting cases that are happening around rights of nature, which I wanted to talk about. But before I go to that point, I wanted to briefly flag another writer relating to called Professor Boaventura de Santos, and apologies for my pronunciation, but he wrote a book called Epistemologies of the South. And he argues that along with colonialism and capitalism and the kind of extractivism that's been seen in the global South, there was also massive destruction of ways of knowing, and he calls that epistemicide. And he says that the Western critical understanding of the world leaves out particular ways of thinking because of the kind of things that happened in the 17th century that I talked about at the beginning of this talk. And some of the things that it misses out are, for example, a deep sense of spirituality, which we find in indigenous traditions, for example, but in many Southern movements, and also a very different attitude towards nature, where nature is seen as part of humans are seen as part of nature rather than it being seen as a resource to be used. And we see these different views coming through in some of the kinds of litigation that we're seeing around rights of nature. For example, there was a case brought by Colombian youth where the court recognized the Amazon as an entity in its own right. You may have read the Al Jazeera article recently talking about the Magpie River in Canada, which has been granted legal personhood. Ecuador has rights of nature in its constitution. In New Zealand, the Wahanganui River and a national park have been recognized as legal entities, with the Maori community acting as the rights holder or the community representing those interests. And that may feel like a very difficult idea to get one's head around. Like, how do you give rights to someone or something that isn't human? But if you stop and think about it, within the Western legal tradition, we do that all the time. They're called companies and trusts, and they even have human rights. So it really does underline that some of these are cultural decisions and assumptions which aren't set in stone in any way. There have been debates around these kinds of rights. 2 rivers in India were granted status as legal entities, and that decision was overturned by the Indian Supreme Court. There were arguments that because these rivers were sacred rivers to particular religions within India, how would that work in a secular country why were all rivers, for example, not regarded as sacred? In the US, attempts to designate particular lakes and rivers as sacred have also been resisted. So there's very much a debate going on here. And so I suppose the key issue is perhaps challenging or having a debate around the dogma that the current way of doing things is the best and only right way, despite the manifest problems that we're seeing. And it's not to totally denigrate or ignore Western critical thinking, but it's considering it in a broader landscape of ways of looking at the world. And this for me is something quite personally relevant because I'm a lawyer raised in the Western positivist legal tradition, but I'm also of an Indian background and did grow up with the understanding that humans are part of the wider nature, sense of nature, and not necessarily superior to it. And it's not the sense that it's there as something to be exploited in quite the same way. So there's a really, obviously the famous Einstein quote that you can't solve problems with the same thinking that created it. And I see this very much now, not only as a battle for specific sites and projects, but actually a struggle relating to what we value and how we understand our place in the world. And that requires giving attention to suppressed or marginalized traditions, not only outside the Western tradition, but even within that tradition. And I think Southern and Indigenous views can have a really crucial part to play in looking in this global discussion and in ways of viewing how we see the world and going forward. And this part of a discussion is a really key aspect of looking at what action we carry on to take. So thank you very much.
Goodness me, that was incredible, Gita. I have like I'm scribbling away here in terms of things I want to ask. I spent 6 months making a season last year that you managed to quantify in 5-10 minutes. So thank you so much. It was brilliant. I'm going to move us swiftly on to Anita, but we're going to come back to Gita to ask her some questions at the end of the presentation. So please do hold on to your questions and we'll come back to them. But over to you, Anita.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this can be seen. Sure. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Thank you. So introduction's already been said. I'm 17. I recently turned 17. That's the biggest thing, and all this is relevant to my presentation. So my first initial thoughts on this question: what can environmental law do to better safeguard and mitigate against inequalities and injustices? So to create adequate laws to mitigate inequalities and injustices, we need to identify what the main inequalities and injustices are. The first thing we must remember is that climate justice is directly linked to social justice, and the two can't be looked at separately. And furthermore, as a youth climate activist, I think environmental law needs to take on board the impact it's going to have on the future generations. So when looking at intersectional environmental justice, the effects of the climate crisis, even in the UK, disproportionately affects marginalised groups. Studies show that Black Africans and Caribbean people account for 15.3% of all Londoners exposed to nitrogen dioxide levels that breach EU limits, but only account for 13.3% of the city's population. This is just one of the many ways that we see social issues affect the extent that people are affected by the climate crisis. This is really important to me because obviously I am a Black activist, and even just in the climate movement, we see a lot of disparities and a lot of excluding people who don't fit the greenwashed version of an eco-friendly person. I think this is really important to look at because we want more people to be involved in the climate movement. We want more people to actually acknowledge climate change and look at how they can help. But when we have a very strict mold on what we think an eco-friendly person is, especially when it's influenced by whitewashed history and a greenwashed and capitalized incentive of our eco-friendly products, it definitely marginalizes and creates a classist and racist movement. The environmental movement is actually the second least diverse movement and career sector in all of them. So I think it's really important that we ensure that people who are disproportionately affected by the crisis are actually getting to speak and actually we're listening to their voices rather than those who we've heard time and time again. Another case to point out regarding environmental law and looking at intersectional environmental justice is Ella Kisidobra. She was the first death to be ruled as air pollution for one of the causes of her death, and that was in the UK. This happened literally just this year, or the back of last year. So I think this is really important to highlight because it's showing that more and more we're seeing the climate crisis affect us. And I think it's important to highlight how it's affecting the UK, because I think in the UK we tend to push it away and say that, you know what, it's happening in more of the global south, and it is, but it's happening here in the UK too, and the effects are being seen by a large majority of groups. So it's important for it to be addressed. The next part is looking at the well-being of the future generations. This is really important to me because young people have to inherit a planet that is ridden by the climate crisis as a consequence of majority older generations ignoring the problem. It's only fair that we create environmental laws that benefit the well-being of the future generations. This is most important because the type of law would give young people a voice to be listened to, and young people have spoken about the climate crisis and listened to the science for years. This is really important again in the line of work that I work in, because I work alongside amazing young people who are doing amazing work, and seeing that these policies that have already been drafted and written and helped by the young people aren't being able to be put into government is heartbreaking, but at the same time it just shows how young people are regarded by current governments and world global leaders. It's also telling how activists are treated in their own countries. An example is Disha Ravi, who was recently arrested. She was a dear friend, a climate activist, and I think it's important to notice how young people are treated by their governments and world leaders, and seeing how their futures aren't protected, not only in the fact that the climate crisis is hitting the planet fast, but also activists are in danger, especially in the global south and in the most affected regions. And I think this is really important to highlight because it's a part of the climate movement that isn't talked about. We see Extinction Rebellion and the arrestables, but we don't tend to see what it looks like when it's not in the UK, when it's in the global south, and those people are fearing their life but still going out to protest. I think it's important to note that it's also a privilege to protest, especially for young people. It's a privilege because their lives are in danger if they're in the global south, and even in the UK, it's very, very risky. And to see young people still want to do that and continue to speak, it's important that we ensure that our environmental laws incorporate this in mind, ensuring that they have to scale the impact of what they're going to do on in future generations, as well as how it's going to affect us now. Because at the end of the day, our future leaders are the young people who are making the noise now. So ensuring that they're listened to is important. Another part of this is what this means for business. One of the biggest environmental laws that would impact businesses would be the implementation of the Green New Deal for a just recovery. This is really important because it ensures that businesses are actually keeping their carbon footprints down and their carbon emissions, which is something that I look at specifically because I run a small business, and it's nice to see how I've been able to make sure that my carbon emissions from my business are kept low. It's a lot easier when it's a small business, I'd have to say, but looking at how bigger companies and bigger corporations can also do the same is really important. Businesses can and should do better to lower their carbon emissions. When the top 100 companies produce 71% of the carbon emissions, there needs to be laws that encourage change and regulate this. This links into the whole consumer versus corporation, who's responsible, who's to blame. I personally think that when we're looking at the climate crisis, it's time to start putting not the blame, but the responsibility and accountability towards the corporations. They can do better, and they should be able to do better. And ensuring that we have laws that help regulate carbon emissions, especially for corporations, is really important, because although everyone has a part to play, it's important to ensure that we're looking at the corporations who do a lot more to the climate and are causing a lot more damage. From using less packaging to ensuring that all products are carbon neutral, corporations, of course, have a huge part to play. The last part I'd like to talk about is COP26. So this is crucial to environmental law on a global scale, as it's particularly important because all eyes are on the UK as they're leading the talks this year. In the next few months, there is still time for the government to add actions to the goals that have already been set. #No More Empty Promises is a campaign that was started by the young people 2 weeks ago, and it's a digital campaign to amplify this. It's ensuring that we are in a position to lead other countries in climate change policies, and it's essential for this year's conference to mean anything. Speaking a bit more about No More Empty Promises, this is a really important campaign, not only for asking the UK government to listen, but asking governments in general to listen. We have a lot of carbon goals, a lot of targets set. What we need to see is action. The targets are great. It's nice to see the climate crisis is being acknowledged, yes, but what we need is real action, listening to the science, and not just listening to it, but implementing the science. This is really important, and it's something that the government should be responsible for and should be held responsible for, because especially now with COP26 coming, we're expecting to see changes and we're expecting the UK to be a leader. In order to be a leader, you need to show some action. Really, this campaign has been an amazing one to be part of, and it's also nice to see that some politicians are right on with it and they would love to see the change. It's making sure that we have a lot more and the vast majority being able to see the change. Again, COP26, when we're looking at environmental law, it's one of the biggest, at least for me, to say like that's where the law is made, that's where the talks happen. So it's important that we are going to get a meaningful COP26, one that when we come out of it, we see real actions, real change, and ensuring that this actually helps people. So that's it for me. That's everything I needed to cover really quickly. Any questions, not to be asked now, but when the Q&A happens, and that's just on social media.
Thank you, Anita. That was amazing. I'm so happy to see youth represented in this conversation, because it's you lot at the beginning and the end of everything, and your generation is crazy smart, always blowing my mind. So thank you for your presentation. I'm going to move it to Julian. Anita's a tough act to follow, so I hope you've brought all your wiles with you, Julian. But I will let you get on.
Well, you know, these are fantastic presentations, and I'm just, you know, honoured to be part of this. And so you might hear an English accent, and yep, I'm a Brit in the US. I'm actually in the Boston metro area, and I want to start, as Thimali did, by something that we're increasingly doing now in the United States, which is offering a land acknowledgement, a land recognition. And I am presenting on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, their past, present and future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. So what I want to talk to you about is a formulation that myself and a group of other people came up with really in the early 2000s, called Just Sustainabilities. This was the key book that we edited, and it really marked a change in thinking about sustainability and sustainable development. One of my concerns was what I called the equity deficit in most sustainability thinking. Whenever you talk to anybody, if you went out on the streets and interviewed 10 people about what is sustainability, sustainable development, they'd say, well, it's about the environment. And yes, of course, it is about the environment, but it's a little bit more than just the environment, because I could see us legislating for a green world, regulating for a green world, but that world could still be deeply socially unjust. We need to center issues of social justice and equity within sustainability. And so really what we were realizing in the early 2000s was what we called, there was an equity deficit in most sustainability thinking. And this book focused entirely on the intersection of equity and justice, or the links between environmental quality and human equality. And my colleagues have mentioned that, you know, these social movements, the environmental movements, typically looked at issues devoid of equity and social justice questions. And similarly, the equalities movement wasn't looking at environmental issues. And I would argue, and it's a key point, we've failed on both environmental protection and social justice because we haven't seen the intersectionalities between the two. And way back in the day, 1988, I was one of the co-founders of Britain's Black Environment Network. I believe Ben is on hold at the moment, but it was one of the first groups in 1988 to really start raising these questions. So to me, sustainability can't simply be a green issue or an environmental concern, important though those issues are. We have to think of sustainability as one where wider questions of social need and welfare and economic opportunity are integrally related to the environmental limits, the real limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. So my definition then of sustainability, or a just sustainability, would be the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And implicit in that are four conditions. We must commit to improving everyone's quality of life and well-being. We must commit to meeting the needs of both present and future generations. So many formulations of sustainability talk about as yet unborn generations. Well, we want social justice now. We want equity now and into the future. I think we need to think about justice and equity, not simply in terms of procedure, which is how people can get involved in policy planning and legal processes, or distribution of goods and bads, but we need to think about recognition. Black Lives Matter is the greatest cry at the moment for recognition. Say Her Name is a great cry for recognition. If we do not recognize the rights to exist of BIPOC groups, of other groups in society, LGBTQ, then how can we ever come to any form of reconciliation, or, as we are discussing now in the US, any form of reparations or any form of restorative justice if we don't think about the notion of recognition? So I want you to really keep that in mind. And then, of course, these three conditions need to be done within ecosystem limits. Now, hanging out as I do in urban planning, I want to just give you three thoughts. Urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. Simple definition. That's what we do as urban planners. How do we help people to coexist in a shared space called the city? Whether we're talking about environmental issues, transport, housing, any other urban conflictual issues, we're doing this coexistence in shared space, not in homogeneous cities, but in cities of difference, where we are constantly in the presence of the other. How do we coexist in shared space with people who are increasingly different from us? It's a challenge, but it's a huge opportunity. I want you to think of the relationship between belonging and becoming. In urban planning, in sustainability, we're always dreaming about a better future, and we mustn't stop doing that. But what we're increasingly forgetting is who gets to belong in these cities? Who do we recognize as having the right to the city? Who do we recognize as being malleable and push-outable, like homeless or underhoused people, or immigrants, or people of color, and low-income groups who are being pushed out by gentrification and displacement? So I think that relationship between belonging and becoming is a really important one. And then in the US, we talk about human scale planning a lot. The Congress for New Urbanism and various urban groups talk about human scale planning. Fine, but I want you to put an E on the word human. I want humane scale planning. I want planning with empathy. I want planning for human dignity. I want planning that respects the rights of all people to be where they want to be. And so, what is the empathic city, the city that embeds dignity into its policy and planning? Can we have that through our legal systems? So I want to give you three quick examples in the 20 minutes I've got. First, Minneapolis. Couldn't be more timely. A lot of things going on in Minneapolis right now, from the trial to the killing because a cop mistook her gun for a taser. Minneapolis, how does one of the most green, liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? I'm then going to talk a little bit about, in a similar vein, food apartheid, how urban planning in the US and housing creates food deserts, period. And then I'm going to finish on a very positive note. In Boston, in November, we have a mayoral election. There are 6 candidates, and they are all of color. 4 are women, 2 are men. This is a big moment in the history of Boston. And I'm going to talk about one particular candidate and some of her policies. So I want to go to Minneapolis, and I want to appreciate the daughter of George Floyd, who I saw sitting on the shoulders of George Floyd's brother, and she said, "My daddy changed the world." And he did, and his memory will continue to live on. But I want to look at urban planning as a tool of white supremacy. And this is the other lesson from Minneapolis. So if you look at the green level, Minneapolis is out there with Portland, Oregon, as being one of the greenest cities in the US. It's got the best park system, 10 years on the trot, according to the Trust for Public Lands. It's one of the best cities in the US for exercise. It's got the 3rd most bike commuters. It's a miracle. No other place mixes affordability, opportunity, and wealth so well. That's if you're white. If you're not white, it's not such a good place to be. Racial inequality in Minneapolis is among the worst in the nation. The black-white income gap is second only to one other city, and I can't remember which one that is. The wealth gap, the home ownership gap, the cascading wealth that goes through generations is appalling. Minneapolis is the lowest in the nation. The opportunity or achievement gap in schools is very high for white and Native American, white and black. So why is this? Why is Minneapolis such an unjust sustainability? It's green, but it's very socially unjust. There's a very interesting project called Mapping Prejudice, and Kirsten Delegard, who's a historian and founder, said all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures darker truths about the city. So, of course, being a critical urban planner, I want to know what those darker truths are. Prior to 1900, Minneapolis had a small but very integrated African-American population. It was spread around the city. And then in the early 1900s, there was a development of racialized covenants. This property shall not be let or sold to anybody other than the Caucasian race. No Negroid, Mongoloid, Turkish, blah, 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 you name it. Horrible, racist, Oriental, all of these words. And you can go to this website and really take a look. These covenants, in a very short time, changed the face of Minneapolis. They began to concentrate the African-American population into North and South Minneapolis. In 1917, the US Supreme Court struck down racist zoning laws. Baltimore had pioneered these, but most US cities had racist zoning laws. Zoning is a way of organizing land use, saying whether it's residential, whether it's commercial. We don't have zoning in Britain, but it's very much in evidence in the United States. So the Supreme Court strikes it down in 1917. And so people are thinking, well, how are we going to segregate people then? If we can't do it on a race basis, I know, let's do it socioeconomically. So they invented single family zoning, homes on single family lots, which are expensive, which keeps out most low income and most minorities in the US. And 70% of residential land in Minneapolis is or was residential zone for single family. So if racialized covenants weren't enough and single family zoning wasn't enough, then in the 30s, 40s, 50s came redlining. Maps of cities in the US were given categories, and the hazardous category, I don't even need to spell out who lived in those kind of neighborhoods, but these hazardous neighborhoods were redlined, and that meant no government mortgages or loans, no private sector loans. This was the beginning, really, of the end of many US cities in terms of quality of life for residents of color, low-income residents. So racialized covenants, racist zoning, then single-family zoning, redlining equals racial segregation then and now. Only one country in the world did it better than the US currently does it, and that's apartheid South Africa with the Group Areas Act. So Heather Worthington, who's the director of long-range planning, she gets it, as does the Minneapolis City Council. There's a direct link between those practices in the late 19th and early 20th century and today's modern zoning plans. Part of the impetus for changing how we view land use is to try to undo those impacts. I put it a lot more simply, urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. So Minneapolis, again, a progressive Democrat, young go-ahead city council, first thing they did was to end single-family zoning, allowing duplexes and triplexes, double and triple units on the single-family zoned land. Other reforms include what's called inclusionary zoning. So any development over a certain number of units has to include some that are affordable. But I want you to take a look at the Minneapolis 2040 plan, goal number 1. Ambitious, but this is where we need to go. In 2040, Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code, having eliminated deep-rooting disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. Minneapolis is trying to do something about it. But I will just say something. We mentioned underrepresentation of people of color, BIPOC, in the environmental movement. 93% of Minneapolis police force don't live in Minneapolis. They don't look like the communities they're policing. Just saying, something's amiss there. Would things be different if the police were more representative of the community? Second area that I wanted to talk about is a continuation, in a sense. You all know about food deserts, food swamps, food apartheid. Urban planning in the US created these food deserts. It wasn't that, you know, the equivalent of Sainsbury's, Whole Foods, it wasn't that they, oh, we don't want to go to that neighborhood. It was urban planning that created these issues. And my point in this article that I wrote is we cannot separate hunger from racist urban planning. Hunger is part of the metabolism of the city. Hunger is a result of racist urban planning. And we see neighborhoods like the one where this kid is here, where there is no food that is, nutritious. These are called food deserts or food swamps, where you have an abundance of fast and junk food. But we're moving away from food deserts and food swamps as names. They further problematize the people living in those. And what we want is really to understand the historical and deeply racialized nature of food access in the United States. So Ashanti Reese, who's an African-American food justice scholar, talks about food apartheid. Food apartheid is intimately related to policies and practices, current and historical, that come from a place of anti-Blackness. And one great case study, and again, I don't have time to go into it right now, but one great case study is looking at the Oakland food desert. Oakland is part of the San Francisco Bay Area, and Nate McClintock, who did the research, said the result of the redlining, driving through freeways through neighborhoods, deliberately breaking up Black neighborhoods, the racist zoning, the single family zoning, the result in Oakland is a crude mosaic of parks and pollution, privilege and poverty, Whole Foods and Whole Food deserts. And for those of you who know, Whole Foods is the kind of trendy upper middle class, organic and non-organic supermarket chain in the US. I do want to say a few words about spatial justice. We don't have many cities in the world today with walls. Jerusalem, Nicosia, Cyprus, Belfast had some, but David Lammy comes up with a great definition, I think, of spatial justice. So he says social justice requires that life chances are not distributed along class or racial lines. Spatial justice requires that they are not distributed geographically. Yet in US cities, that's precisely what we have. We have life chances distributed according to not walls, but a road. Here's a road, the Delmar Boulevard in St. Louis. And north of the boulevard, the Delmar Divide, as it's called, is largely African-American, low income, low level of education. South of the boulevard is the white neighborhood, higher home values, higher income, more bachelor's degrees. The Delmar Divide shows that in the US, in many cities, your zip code, your postcode, your zip code is a better predictor of health than your genetic code. Spatial injustice, urban planning, zoning, keeping certain people in certain neighborhoods. Now, let's remember where zoning came from. It came from Chadwick and the public health inquiry into the cholera epidemic in London. Chadwick, a public health advocate, advocated separating out land uses. Well, Americans thought, why just separate out land uses? Let's separate out people. That's where racist segregationist zoning came from. And you can see how urban planning is a tool of white supremacy. And I want to finish up really talking again about the importance of leadership and the importance of recognition. And I want to, give a shout out to Michelle Wu, whose campaign I've been helping, one of the 6 candidates of color that is standing for mayor of Boston. Here's why I like Michelle's campaign. She opens her food justice agenda for a resilient Boston with these words. Food justice means racial justice, demanding a clear-eyed understanding of how white supremacy has shaped our food systems. Recognition. If you start with this recognition, you can go a long way to developing a food justice agenda that picks apart white supremacy. But if you don't say these words, if you don't say her name, how can you recognize the real issues that need to be dealt with? You know, it's not simply an economic issue, food injustice. It is a race and segregationist issue. She also has a Green New Deal for Boston. And again, her analysis is that this Green New Deal will close the racial wealth gap and help to dismantle structural racism. So what I've tried to show here is how urban planning in the US, and it differs greatly in the UK, urban planning in the US has been used, it's been enrolled as a specific tool of white supremacy to alter the health of neighborhoods, the Del Mar Divide, to alter food access in neighborhoods, to alter the access to good housing and to good job opportunities. Thank you.
Speechless. Thanks, Julian. That was beautiful. In particular, because it's something I've been thinking a lot of as somebody who's lived in New York City for 17 years, is that cities are still a part of nature, and it's something that we don't consider and think about. But my dear friend Mary Annalise Hegler, who hosts a show called Hot Take, she's a brilliant writer too, talks a lot about how nature is in the air that we breathe, it's on our skin, it's in the rainfall, it's everywhere. And so even though we feel that we could be separate, that we actually, there are ways to contextualize nature, even if we don't think that we are immersed in it. So I really appreciate that. And we'll come back to that too. So Consolata, blow it up for us. Do it.
Let's go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you firstly to PIEL for inviting me today. And thank you all for listening. I feel your presence. I feel your presence. And I'm so grateful to the wonderful panelists for sharing their knowledge and this space with me today. And so, faced with the question, what can environmental law do to better safeguard and mitigate against inequalities and injustice? I came up with 5 words whilst thinking about this and thinking about how to phrase my response and share my presentations. And the words are acknowledge, change, include, amplify, and implement. Finish, that's it. No, I'm joking. There's lots to say about all these words, and I will develop as I go about the presentation. I will develop how I think we should bring attention to this to these words. So the context for both how we experience the environmental crisis and how we respond to it are vastly different, as everyone has also shared, depending on where we are from. For example, I was born in Nigeria. I grew up in Italy, and now I'm based in London. And I can see all the various, all the differences in terms of access to resources, whether it's water, access to food, in these different countries, and how socioeconomic status and race and all these different intersecting identities have played in my presence here today. So I recognize that I am extremely privileged to even have a laptop to be speaking to you and sharing my knowledge in this field. So we are all in the same storm. There's this quote that says, we are all in the same storm, but not all in the same boat. And let's start from this. The climate crisis is already here, and its impact is obviously unjust and unevenly distributed. The climate crisis is a racial justice issue, a socioeconomic justice issue, and a health issue. The impact of the climate crisis does really depend on the different intersecting marginalized identities that people hold. This means, for example, as you use myself also, for example, earlier, but it goes even deeper to explain that People, for example, that are being most impacted by the climate crisis in the world are people of color, women and femmes, low-income people, and all other intersecting marginalized groups of people. European colonialism and the world that we live in today, whether we like it or not, are rooted in a white supremacist system of oppression. Domination and profit were made possible by the ideologies which legitimized violence and extraction. These were ideologies that said some lands and some people are worth less, justifying ecocide, genocide, and enslavement. An ideology supporting the effort to build a capitalist society to provide resources for the privileged, using the bodies of people of color to facilitate this. But we have a choice to disrupt this systematically and systemically by placing racial and social justice work inside of the climate justice fight, because these are very much interwoven. In terms of environmental law, what we see within the environmental law field, in the broader field, is actually a snippet of the inconsistencies and injustices happening in the world today. I came across a quote the other day that said, George Floyd, or the most recent Daunte Wright, killed by the police at a traffic stop 2 days ago, isn't a wake-up call. The same alarm has been ringing since 1619, and we all have been hitting the snooze button. I couldn't agree more with this quote, because non-recognition and oblivion are the very oxygen of the fire of the oppressive systems that we live in. And so accountability can only flow from awareness. Therefore, I think it's important to take the time to really understand and truly listen without prejudice, because it is that very prejudiced thinking of superiority and civilization of the white man over the black man that brought us where we are today. A few months back, I wrote an article for the UK Environmental Law Association where I discussed how problematic and exhausting it is that the environmental law field in the UK is not representative, for example, of the communities impacted by the effects of climate change the most. I'm really beginning to despise this mantra, but it is the painful reality which we must face. Climate change is real, and its effect on the most affected people and areas is very real. Just to quickly clarify my use of most affected people and areas, and I will be using this acronym MAPA because it is a way to definitely express most affected people and areas, and it is a collective noun spreading currently within the environmental justice movement, which is preferred to use, the use of terms like global south or developing countries for your really for the lack of specificity of those realities. Because when we sometimes tend to say global south or developing countries, there's this bigger conglomeration of all these countries. And what we know in reality is that the realities are very much different within those contexts. So last month, again, I joined a webinar organized by Bad Activist Collective and Pass the Mic Climate, who facilitated a panel to celebrate the Global Day of Climate Action. Activist Aishka Najib gave a very important overview of why using MAPA is preferred to using terms like Global South and developing countries. She explained that MAPA is used to refer to people who are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, whether they live in areas which are prone to its effect, whether they are part of the less privileged or part of the oppressive systems that affect their ability to effectively respond to the crisis. MAPAs therefore include people who have been historically colonized and subjected to intersectional systemic oppression. Therefore, indigenous, black and brown communities who have been fighting and are at the forefront of the environmental justice movement. In terms of MAPA and its intersection with race, we can argue that it has a national and international reach. As has been advocated for Friends of the Earth, climate change and air pollution issues are race issues. In 2019, FO conducted studies with the help of communities up and down the country, which really exposed the illegal air quality condition in thousands of UK locations. In addition, a UK government report on racial equality impact assessment found higher risk of exposure of Black British children to air pollution than white children. As my colleague Anita mentioned earlier, the tragic story of 9-year-old Black girl Ella Kisi Deborah, who lived close to one of London's busiest roads, is a painful example of how vulnerable members of society are increasingly harmed by air pollution. Ella suffered a fatal asthma attack in 2013 after the pollution on the road near her house repeatedly broke EU legal limits in the years leading up to her death. Again, West London campaign groups like Clean Air for Southall and Hayes, Cash are yet another reminder that the most toxic substances, the most dangerous industries, and the most polluted roads are in the backyards of the poor, which in this country all too often means the backyards of Black and people of color. Communities and their stories therefore have a significant role in climate action and litigation. One of the options to fight climate change and address corporate and government inaction is climate litigation. There are various initiatives across the globe on using the legal sword as an ecocentric and/or anthropocentric pathway for climate justice. And the recent Four Supreme Court case is a powerful attempt for innovative legal action and thinking around climate justice. Another promising example is the case concerning oil spills in the Niger Delta region in Nigeria. The case concerning four Nigerian farmers and Milieu Defensie, which is a Dutch NGO, the Dutch NGO Friends of the Earth, against Shell. And in this case, the claimants, as I said, were four Nigerian fish farmers who held both Shell Nigeria and its parent company, Royal Dutch Shell, liable for the negligent maintenance of the pipelines and wellhead, inadequate response to spills, and insufficient cleanup, thereby causing long-term damages. These judgments of the Court of Appeal of The Hague are of seminal importance for improving accountability of transnationally operating business for the violations of human and environmental rights. Such pollution proximity findings are not confined to Britain or Nigeria, though. As Julian has also mentioned, studies conducted in the US on environmental racism also show the race factor in how this really is a predicament or indicator of proximity to pollution. The effects of this correlation can be examined both in distributive justice terms relating to the distribution of environmental burdens and in procedural justice terms relating to decision-making process that lead to those distributions. And so I believe the question that follows this is, with all this collective awareness happening now, why should we amplify Black voices? The amplification of Black voices within the environmental and climate advocacy movement is essential because the world needs to acknowledge that the inner mechanics of the environmental and climate action movements are constructed in ways that exclude Black indigenous people of color. Despite being amongst those who experience the effects of the climate crisis first, marginalized groups are systematically and systemically not given adequate recognition, representation, or access to the spaces and meetings where decisions are made, decisions that influence their livelihood. As Black advocates, activists, disruptors, builders, storytellers, organizers, lawyers, planners, we are more than the collective sting of our traumas. We are more than diversity quotas. We are real, we exist, our expertise, opinions, and perspectives matter. It's really absurd to even be mentioned, screaming down the streets that our lives matter. The systemic disregard of Black people in the environmental law and policy sector is very real. Back in July 2020, again, at the height of the lockdown, I witnessed another familiar and disappointing demonstration of the lack of representation and awareness within the environmental sector. I joined a webinar that discussed the impact of climate change in Commonwealth countries. When the webinar began, I had to do a quick Google search to double check the ethnic composition of Commonwealth countries. And I was pleased to confirm that the vast majority of the 53 country members are comprised of African, Caribbean, and Asian countries. However, guess what? The panelists were exclusively white men. And so it was only white men who were leading the conversation and offering perspective about the impact of climate change on a group of countries which are predominantly populated by people of color. I don't know about you listening to this now, but this rang so many alarm bells for me. It was a striking example of how the lack of inclusion is widespread and ingrained within the international environmental policy sector. That seminar for me really highlighted that being merely non-racist is an outdated minimum humanity threshold that must be superseded by active anti-racism work. Eliminating all forms of structural discrimination is both a condition and the end result of just and equitable economies. Accordingly, in becoming anti-racist, our organizations must have an equitable representation of BAME individuals in the workspaces. This should develop through a working culture that promotes inclusive recruitment, retention, and progression opportunities for people of color. Policymakers, on the other hand, and stakeholders must therefore prioritize anti-racism work and ensure their policies and practices are not contributing to the perpetuation of injustice, such as impunity for corporation, exploitative labor conditions, and gendered, racial, or class-based inequities. Environmental racism can manifest implicitly and explicitly as racism in general. It may be as overt as the infamous comments of Lawrence Summers, chief economist and vice president of the World Bank from 1991 to 1993, who in a leaked memoranda asked, "Between me and you, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the less developed countries?" I'm adding some emphasis here. In other words, Summers suggested that the poorest countries in the world, already environmentally devastated by Western extractive industries, also become the backyard for toxic waste and dumping. As corporations extend their reach around the globe, many communities bear unjust burdens, and these communities must be able to speak out and to protect their human rights, environment rights, and their health. Countries like Tanzania and the Democratic Republic of Congo play a role in protecting, a vital role, a key role in protecting the environment and the traditional lifestyles in Africa. Nevertheless, they are facing challenges to the mining, forestry, agribusiness sector, as public interest advocates and activists in MAPA fight for vulture multinational corporations. Using the DRC again as an example, the Congo Basin, which spans 6 countries and makes up one of the most important wilderness areas left on Earth, is home to the 2nd largest rainforest in the world, much of which right now lies within the DRC. The rich tropical forest sustains many traditional communities. However, the region also faces threats to communities and the key ecosystem because it is a highly coveted destination for mining, forestry, and agribusiness, as I mentioned. And so the absence of proper participation in the decision-making process to finance the extractive projects and the inadequate consideration of the impact of the project on local communities demonstrate how the systemic and ongoing appropriation of the Global South ecological resources is reinforced by political and economic dominance. Women and femmes must have access to the environment sector in general, in order to collect and share the wisdom to strategize and ultimately influence norms and policy setting at local, regional, and global level. Goal 5 of the SDGs of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, is a very important one, in my opinion, to secure environmental justice and sustainability. Gender equality and intersectionality in health and education are fundamental in tackling the climate issues we face today. In practical ways, gender equality reduces emissions, for example, by safeguarding women who have valuable knowledge and by granting them the freedom of choice and access to education and resources. When women can access loans, political office, or land ownership, that means half of the population is left out of the workforce and sustainability decisions. Grassroots women must be able to share their acts of resistance and strategies and how they define just and equitable recovery transitions based on their realities, their struggles, and the work they do every single day. Women and feminists worldwide have been and are working at the grassroots and international level to advance transformative cross-cutting solutions and climate policies that center the leadership of women and acknowledge and address the generational impacts of colonization and racism while pushing forward climate justice. Women are on the front lines of climate impacts and solution, and it is time for them to be recognized as at the forefront of climate action plans and decision making. I'd like to remind us about this. We are nature on the various micro and macro aspects of our being, of our very essence. The sooner we truly realize and rewild and get back into how intricate our relationship is with our surroundings, the earlier we will be able to reach the goals we're about to discuss at COP26. The future isn't written in stone, it is what we make it. And I certainly hope that for the sake of my ancestors and the generations to come, that we reinvent a future different than what we are currently crash racing into. And that we may begin to all actively shape it with compassion for the benefit of humankind and Mother Earth and all its beings. In order to close the North-South perception gap as well, in my opinion, I think it's important to, it's also useful to relate the environmental breakdown discourse to the social context within which the environmental problem develops, and step back from the specificity of biodiversity loss narratives, which are absolutely very important, but they are people also. In my opinion, it is counterproductive to solve the climate emergency in ways that replicate the current social construct that harms humans and enables the perpetration of injustice in the world we live in. We need solutions that boost rather than suppress human well-being and economic justice, and we need a movement which is built and fostered through intersectional capacity building. We need urgent, persistent inclusion in all areas for major collective action to tackle environmental justice. And we must all actively speak up for the right to health of people and for a healthy planet. An active attitude encourages and inspires others to talk to those people not like themselves and to broaden their cross-movement collaboration into stronger, more diverse, inclusive, and powerful ones, where we continue learning and unlearning, most importantly as well, from each other. We need everybody at this point, my people. There are inspiring people and communities to look back to, and there are innumerable activists and campaigners like late Mr. Ken Saro-Wiwa, assassinated in Nigeria, who have been taking action to build and protect a healthy planet for the future. In an era of continued oppression, fossil fuel expansion, and false climate solutions, the voices of grassroots, frontline, and indigenous women leaders could not be more important as they work worldwide to build the vision, the strategies, the solutions necessary to shape a healthy and equitable future for all. And so to conclude, to truly support adaptation and resilience to climate change, we need a thorough system change. And this means moving away from promoting capitalist, top-down false solutions and pushing forward and supporting community-driven solutions centered on care for all people and the planet over profit. Thank you.
Consolata. Yes, she did it. She blew it up. I'm going to welcome everybody back into the room, actually. I think it was amazing, absolutely amazing. I think everyone will agree that that was so great. And I feel like I do host a lot of panels, but this one was really pretty special. So thank you so much. Yeah, the commonality, I think, is this wonderful presumption that talent and creativity and intelligence belongs to white, Western educated, cis het males, and people who will sort of uphold those that trope, because were more space created by that group, there would be an awful lot of work that we could get done. And something I describe frequently is this concept of half-baked solutions. Like, if you don't have everybody in the room, all different kinds of people in the room, particularly people who these issues pertain to, and preferably having them lead, you're going to end up with half-assed solutions, and nobody wants that, particularly given that we have an opportunity here to cap poverty, you know, amongst a host of other things. There's so many opportunities in what happens next. And the answers are already here. Like, we've heard them all through all of your presentations. Like, we know what to do and how to do it. We're just waiting for the space to open up for us to just get on with it. And that's apparent in all of your presentations. So thank you for that. So we are going to do some Q&A, but what I would like to challenge our guests to do, because I'm obviously a huge fan of solutions through my show, is see if you can sort of arch your responses towards solutions, because that's something that's really quite difficult when we talk about climate and climate justice, is sort of leaving people hanging with despair. But again, I think the power of having folks of color in this conversation is that we've thought about so many of these solutions already. So please, I would encourage you to do that. So I'm going to start with Gita. As I said, I can't believe you summarized like 6 months of my work in like 10 minutes. I'm like so in awe. Thank you for that. The one issue that I certainly keep coming back to in my work is the idea of reparations also. And just to sort of expound a little bit on a little of what Gita was talking about, the UNFCCC has come up with these two concepts: the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage and the Green Climate Fund. And the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage was set up in an attempt to bring reparations to global South nations and Arctic indigenous communities to receive funds for damage done due to industrialization from global North countries. And then the Green Climate Fund was established to kind of invest in countries who are experiencing challenges to climate change. I think I have summarized that decently, at least. Gita, please clarify if I do. But I just wanted to get a sense from you, you know, how we can go about getting, you know, putting more work into reparations, like how we can, you know, we've got all these countries who are willing to invest in the Green Climate Fund, but aren't willing to admit the level of despair that has been created through all these years of industrialization. And if we can quantify 1.5 degree temperature rise, surely we can quantify damage done to these nations. So what do you think it would take to make that happen?
I think the issue here is definitely political rather than structural. I think, as you were saying, the controversy around loss and damage and generally funding around the UNFCCC is never referred to as reparations or anything like that. It's common but differentiated responsibilities is, I think, as far as it's gone, as a concept of saying, okay, we're more responsible, so that means we have to support you, but there's no sort of sense of reparations for harm done, and even the sniff of that had it running a mile, and countries running a mile. And the US, as I mentioned, was instrumental in having that decision that went along with the text, which nobody pays any attention to now, thankfully. But it was actually, there was a point where some of the draft texts that were going around, and I was in Paris at the time, were very specifically looking like they might have a chilling effect even on litigation going on. So I could suppose the practical pragmatist answer is in terms of continuing to have the debate and making sure that those issues are very, very live, and looking at what angles exist to push it in practical terms. So cases, for example, litigation, even if that's not the language that is specifically used in those contexts, because it can't be, if they are getting some traction, and then the wider debate is happening, and there is this sense of general understanding and awareness of what has happened. Because I certainly feel, even as a lawyer, until I left being in house in an NGO and did this further work and understanding about, you know, what happened in Europe and all of these particular, even though I understood about colonialism, I didn't understand the context in anything like the same way. And I think education and understanding and that openness is really, really important in terms of having the debate, and then using whatever practical levers, whether they're cases or funds, even if that language isn't language that can be engaged with in those spheres. So I would say both those approaches. That would be my suggestion.
Brilliant. Just throwing that out there. Just that genius. Love it. Okay, I'm going to keep going round, actually, just so we can get a little bit from everybody. Anita, I wanted to your presentation was wonderful, and actually I'm glad that Julian brought up Minneapolis so much, because yes, Dante Wright was killed this week, and George Floyd, all these things. And I was actually in Minneapolis for the protests around Jamar Clark, and what was interesting to see was that it was Black people from the community who were sort of standing on the perimeter, and it was white people in the center sort of banging drums, being loud, taking up space. So I wanted to ask you, what do you feel an environmental organization looks like? How would it be better organized, given your perspective?
I think, especially knowing to what you just said, an ideal environmental organization would acknowledge the fact that Black people, people of color, are more likely to be tested, harassed by the police, especially when looking at protests. And I think that's something that environmental organizations, at least in the UK and seen in America, don't take into consideration at all. Extinction Rebellion, one that always comes to mind, is their big focus on being part of the Arrestables and kind of encourage people to be part of the Arrestables, saying that this is the way to show that you care about the planet, is a really harmful and detrimental way of an environmental organization running. This is because not everyone has the privilege to be part of the Arrestables. Not everyone can say if they were part of the Arrestables, they'd be fine after it. And I think this is something that environmental organizations throughout are getting wrong and are getting mixed up about. Yes, we want to make change, and we want to ensure that people are listening and people are seeing us take up space. However, it should be done in a safe manner that allows especially people of color, Black people, to feel safe and to feel like they are in a position where they should and can take up space. Again, just looking at the sites you saw at the protest, it should be people of color, Black people on the inside taking up space, making the noise. And I think because we don't see that enough, and this is a discussion that isn't had enough because it's not something you think about when you first think of a protest. I think that's why we're seeing that, and organizations aren't taking this into account. However, clearly with the discussions on BLM and how it intersects with the climate crisis and climate justice, I think organizations are starting, some of them anyway, are starting to look at ensuring that the Black people in their organizations feel safe when protesting, and also looking at more Black leadership in these environmental working groups and organizations is also really important.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. Julian, I was listening to your presentation, which was so thorough. I'm so grateful for it. I was thinking about a moment I had when I got to visit the Hopi Reservation in northern Arizona, and the Hopi people have been pushed over years as land was negotiated over time in the US. They were pushed into highly or areas of the world where they cannot grow anything at all. And actually, whilst those their friends had one of their horses had keeled over and died, like you can't grow anything. And so they're completely dependent on food boxes from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and full of effectively plastic food from giant mega corporations, the Procter and Gambles, and I think it is very connected to how we talk about public lands, protecting indigenous lands and protecting public lands, which seem like it is going to be the biggest fight of our lives for the rest of the century. So what do you think? Can you point to specific ways that we can go about doing that, being able to protect public lands, and where you see the opportunities lie?
First thing I want to say is how proud I am and honoured to be on an all person of colour panel, including the moderator. I mean, let's give it. This doesn't happen that often. Hey, I've been around longer than you guys, and it was lonely 20 or 30 years ago. It's getting less lonely now. So thank you for your service and for doing the work you do, and especially to young women of colour who are, I think, pushing the Democratic Party here in the US. Thimali, I hope you'll agree.
I do,
really pushing the Democratic Party in a progressive direction. So to your question, look, the settler colonial project is only just gearing up. I mean, we think about the settler colonials as being, the people that came to the US and, established, as the Brits did in Australia, terra nullius, this land belongs to no one, and then started to appropriate it. The most recent iteration is gentrification. What is gentrification if it isn't, a continuation of the settler colonial project, moving out lower income and poor and minority people so that they can appropriate the value that has been bestowed into neighborhoods, not just the value, monetary value, but the cultural and other social capitals that make gentrifying neighborhoods desirable. So, let's put this in a historical context. This is just a continuation. I teach a class on food justice for urban planners, and there's a really interesting book chapter that we read about a tribe up in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, well, on the Oregon-California border. And what it made me realize is that genocide is not just killing people, guns, shooting them, whatever. It's destroying their food systems. You destroy somebody's food system, as the salmon fisheries have been destroyed up there, as the trees that grew the nuts for the, genocide is a total annihilation through any means. And what's happened to the Hopi, what's happening to a lot of people in being pushed onto lands that are not favorable to a traditional way of life. This is how we have destroyed these cultures. I'd like to see much more intersectionalities between the kind of land, the land preservation, land conservation, public lands conservation people, and people working for First Nations and Indigenous rights. Again, I mentioned in my talk, we have an environmental movement, we have social justice movements. We are now beginning to see a more just sustainabilities type movement, a recognition that, I think Consolata, you brought up the case of Ken Saro-Wiwa. 10 years before Ken Saro-Wiwa, what was he called? The president of the Brazilian Rubber Tappers Union, Chico Mendes, was killed in the Amazon. And I remember Friends of the Earth in the UK saying, oh my God, Green Rainforest campaigner killed. He was president of the Brazilian Rubber Tappers Union. He was a social justice and human rights activist, but he understood that the integrity of the rainforest was integral to the survival of both his workers and indigenous people. So in the global South and in indigenous nations, they get it. When Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed, he was called an environmentalist, but he was working for the Ogoni for their human rights as well. So we can't just call them green campaigners or social justice campaigners, but they are very effective because they straddle these issues. And I'd like to see a similar kind of straddling in US activism. We're still too shoehorned into different movements, and nobody wants to tread on anybody's toes, so they stick to their issues, their mission. And we could be much more effective if we were to be able to see environmental protection through a social justice lens, and that includes the livelihoods and the cultures of all First Nations, Indigenous people in the US.
Brilliant. Absolutely, 100% agree. You're so right. It does come down to everyone realizing that all of these issues intersect completely. And you know, the narratives are around climate and environment, sadly, are still run by white narratives. So we don't think of them as being something that's apparent happening now, rather that's something that's going to happen in the future. But for so many, yeah.
One other example. So I remember back in 1990, I was doing something in the UK. I left the UK in 98. I was doing something in London for, I think it was some radio station. Anyway, they asked me to interview environmental groups about whether they felt representative of multicultural Britain in the early 1990s. And I remember speaking to somebody, a press officer at Greenpeace, and I asked her, you know, is multiculturalism, is equity important to you guys? She said, equity is not an issue for us. We're here to save the world. You can laugh or you can cry at what she said. I understand her. I understand what she means. She thinks, hey, we're Greenpeace. We're here to save the world. What more equitable thing could we do than save the planet for everybody? But what she didn't realize was that the people on the board of directors of Greenpeace didn't look like Britain. The people working for Greenpeace didn't look like Britain. The agenda that Greenpeace was setting didn't look like an urban agenda or anything that could you know, improve the livelihoods of people living in a London, in a Manchester, in a Glasgow, or whatever. So there is this misunderstanding, I think, amongst environmentalists that you know, what they're doing is equitable. And yes, in many ways it is. But who gets to decide the agenda that they are following? And that, I think, was where I really, in the early 90s, started to look to the US environmental justice movement as a way of bridging. And that's why we set up the Black Environment Network. But our first issue was access to the countryside. We were looking at why is rural Britain so white? Why don't Black people feel comfortable going there? And people like Ingrid Pollard, I don't know if you know Ingrid. Ingrid does these amazing photographs of Black people and juxtaposes them into white spaces. And so Ingrid helped us to get this campaign going. But you know, that was our first, what we called an environmental justice issue in the Black Environment Network in '88, was really looking at rural racism and the reasons why there were so few people of color going to the countryside.
Yeah, absolutely. We did an episode on exactly that, actually. Mary Annie Segler and I took a walk through a park to have this exact discussion, because I would love to be able to live in nature, but it doesn't feel like a safe place for me, safe thing for me to do yet. But hopefully that will change in the future. Consolata, what do you think? Do you think that Western governments are just pushing their polluting projects to global South nations to deal with, so they can make their own domestic climate targets? It's a big question, but
Could you repeat that? I think I missed the beginning of your question.
Yeah, no, I was asking if you think that we've got Western governments, maybe UK governments, who are pushing their polluting projects to global South nations so that they can sort of artificially meet their own domestic climate targets.
I mean, absolutely, absolutely. The whole idea of imperialism and the whole idea of colonialism and the whole idea of implicit racism and explicit racism is about this. Sometimes, it's not really evident to the naked eye. Sometimes, even speaking about social justice issues and race justice issues, people do not realize that racism is not just the policeman killing or shooting. So it's not just the act of violence, the explicit one, but there's so many different layers to it, like the tip of the iceberg, and that image everybody is kind of acquainted to at this point. So absolutely, we have, whilst I was working with Friends of the Earth, the legal team was involved with the funding fossil fuel abroad projects. So again, it was a matter of really explaining and really engaging with the locals of Mozambique and really actually understanding how they wanted to, how they wanted to engage with the UK government and all these investments they were making in the area. So absolutely, it is unfortunately a very real reality because the issues and the discrepancies there were so many. And absolutely, the UK government is the whole choices of administering funds through the various departments needs more clarity, and the government makes it difficult for NGOs, for example, to access this information with all the caveats that they make, because obviously there's freedom of information, we have access to information, but in a way, the way they make it hard for NGOs to keep up with all the requests of environmental information requests or letters and the different caveats they use are quite striking. So there we can absolutely push as NGOs, as the area of holding the government to account. We can definitely push that narrative in terms of supporting NGOs to keep digging and to keep asking and to keep funding these projects. However, it's an unfortunate and very, very real reality, the one that brings government to go into these most affected countries and global South countries and developing countries, research-rich countries, to extract without facing the consequences of their actions. Absolutely.
Mm. We've actually got tons of questions coming in from our audience, so thank you to everyone who is posting questions. This is so great. I'm actually, before I get to that, I did want to ask Gita one question about some of the legal challenges that have been coming up in the UK recently. I know that, as through Friends of the Earth, there've been a lot of carbon intensive infrastructural projects that were sort of failed in the courts recently, or attempts to bring them to the courts failed recently. And I'm wondering if you feel that litigation still has a useful role in combating climate change and biodiversity loss, and if not, how you feel like it can be supplemented, what the legal sector needs to be able to make bigger wins.
Okay, well, the first thing I'd say is that law never works on its own. Law really needs to be part of a campaign. It's a tool, but it needs to have be part of a campaign, engagement, a clearer understanding. In the UK in particular, I'm sure in other contexts too, it's always a very slim chance of winning judicial reviews, which are challenges to government decisions. And that's partly because of the UK. The way that challenges work is that you can't really challenge you can challenge the law, where they followed the law or the process. But if you want to challenge the rights and wrongs of a decision against the government in the UK, you effectively have to show it was mad, which is quite a high threshold to be standards. And you can use a lot with the process and the law, and you can, but often sometimes the decision gets taken, it has to be taken again. But I think Heathrow is a really good example. I mean, they've been trying to expand it for, I don't know how many years, and I have a view that no lawyer should have to deal with the Heathrow expansion more than once in their career, but it kind of just keeps coming back like a bad penny. But every time it's been headed off, and that's been through a combination of law and political approaches. And every time this happens, and even cases that are lost, you don't know what the ramifications are behind the event, how close they came, what it led to in terms of government advice or company advice. So the mere fact of litigation being brought can have enormous ripples. It can also really concentrate, because it becomes David and Goliath, so the public can really see an issue
Right.
as an event, and that can be really important too. And it's an ongoing thing. I mean, a few years ago, well, not even a few years, a couple of 10, 20 years ago, these cases weren't happening. And then
Right.
Paris, even though Paris is very weak, it did sort of unleash this kind of tide of people saying, okay, we've got this agreement, let's try and use it. And there's this sort of battering ram approach, and some get through and some don't. But overall, law is one part, and it can only ever be one part, but it can play a useful role. And even if something doesn't win at that point, it doesn't mean it's not kind of contributing. But it's almost like activism broadly. If you try and take it on its own, and you think, even as an activist, what did I do? What difference did I make to this massive, enormous, difficult problem? It can feel really overwhelming. But realizing that you're part of a tapestry, and that what you're doing, you may never understand which bits of things, how they worked or how they fitted in, but it doesn't mean that those things aren't actually contributing to something which could be quite substantial.
Oh, that's aspirational in every way. Thank you. I'm
Right.
great. Yeah, that's awesome, right? It's true, because I think it's like, it's sorry, Consolata, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't realize you didn't hear me. No, I just wanted to quickly add that in terms of I totally agree with what Gita was sharing. And also, I think one thing, really practical thing to understand in terms of all this public interest, litigation cases that are brought, and the persuasive argument and the persuasive trail that they leave, because at the end of the day, not in a mean way, but the generation is changing, and reasonings obviously are changing in different ways. So it's important to keep bringing and keep challenging this the judicial attitude, essentially, and to find ways and to continue finding ways to keep bringing these conversations forward, because it's really important. Because precedent, yes, it's precedent, but it does change. The things that were law 100 years back are not law now. So there's still this. I think it's promising a little bit, definitely, to know that there is a generational change happening, and there is a different kind of awareness happening. People are no more saying, "What is climate change? Is it real?" People actually know that this is real. So yeah, just to add that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's this, we want everything to happen now, obviously, with urgency. It requires urgency, but being able to know that, especially in terms of litigation, that it will require some consistency, and it's okay that it doesn't happen instantly. We're literally changing the status quo of centuries, that are centuries old. So the work that we're doing now actually is incredible, absolutely incredible, and is happening very rapidly given the context of time that we're looking at.
Sorry, just very quickly,
Yeah.
even on that, just ecocide, like when a few years ago, it was just really, really marginal. And now it's got a panel with some really good lawyers coming up with a definition. Things are moving quite fast in terms of ideas that were really seen as fringe not that long ago. It doesn't mean that they're going to win court cases necessarily right now, or maybe not even for another 5-10 years. But the fact that these ideas are being grasped at, really, it speaks to the point about epistemologies I think I was making, about how this circle is widening, and the people whose voices are able to be heard also enrich and engage in a different way, and allow for different solutions and better solutions.
Exactly.
Than we've had.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And in terms of being well paced over long periods of time, I think no one does that better than the youth climate movement, honestly. So I'm going to come to Anita, because we've actually got a question from an audience member specifically for you. What are some ways that young climate activists could be better supported by lawyers and politicians, but also by the general population?
I think one of the biggest ways is changing the attitudes towards young people and young climate activists. I think, at least when I first started with my activism type of journey, I was 11, and the ideas and how people thought about climate activists and young people having a say wasn't as positive as it is now. I mean, now we get articles written about us and how inspirational we are. Back then, it was more, we're making a lot of noise and disrupting the status quo, and it wasn't seen as a good thing. It was, they're really noisy, they're children, they're so disrespectful to the older generation. And I think, although it started to change and it's changed for the better, there clearly needs to be a lot more change surrounding youth activists and how they're treated, because of how young people are seen and their voices are seen as not as important. There is a lot of doubt, or basically a prejudice towards young people when they're speaking. It's like, well, we've been here longer, and that's completely understandable. A lot of older people have a lot more experience, but these young people know what they're talking about. They have done the research, they've lived through it, and I think it's important that they are listened to. Looking at ways lawyers and politicians can support young activists. Politicians specifically, I think not only do they need to listen to the young people, but start to implement what the young people are saying. I say this because I've had a lot of politicians listen. It's great, they sound like they really care, but they implement policies or implement legislation that says the exact opposite of what we spoke about. So I think it's important to ensure that when the politicians are listening or giving a listening ear, that they are going to take this into consideration, and they're also going to update young people. I think a lot of things when looking at youth activism is adult groups or corporations will ask us to come up with a campaign and then listen to us, use our suggestions, views, great, and then we never hear any feedback, or we don't get to see what happens afterwards. And I think it's something that people have just thought was normal because they're just young people, like there isn't any more to update them on. And I think it's unfair, and it doesn't accurately use or help young people because you've kind of thrown them under the bus after they've given you what you needed. And I think this is really important because, again, young people are going to be future leaders, our future scientists, etc. And ensuring that they feel empowered now is really important in looking at how they're going to change the world positively and how they're actually going to act when they come of age to also take accountability.
Yes, accountability is the word, I think, because it's not, it's also an issue in corporate world and within government, this whole concept of greenwashing that is being called out, which I love. Being the greenwashing is going to be the issue of the next 10 years, certainly. I think we're all going to end up having to battle. So accountability is definitely the word. And again, the youth climate movement is brilliant at being able to do that. Julian, I think maybe 3 different people wanted me to ask you this question. So I'm going to pick one. So Sylvia says, fantastic presentation on urban planning as an instrument to perpetuate white supremacy. I've been investigating in particular the phenomenon of green gentrification in the urban context and encountered a lot of interesting US-based examples. How do you think the reality in the States compares to the one of cities in the UK?
Great question. And I did take a sneak preview at it, actually. Look, I wish I had longer. I wish I had longer for my presentation because I deal specifically with green gentrification as a spatial injustice. I mean, what's happening in the US? We're getting neighborhoods that are literally, more walkable, more cyclable, more tree-lined. We call them complete streets, where the automobile has been decentered in favor of active transportation, walking and cycling. These come at a cost premium. All right, they come at a cost premium, and again, greenlining is like redlining, but redlining was explicitly racist. Greenlining is in the name of sustainability. So, what are we going to do about that? We can't say it's racist, but the very effect of these more expensive neighborhoods looks like redlining, because these green neighborhoods are largely white neighborhoods. And I would say the key measurable of urban sustainability is walkability. How walkable is your neighborhood? There's an app called WalkScore for measuring that. Guess who owns the app? It's a big real estate company in the US called Redfin. So we have commodified sustainability to the point where you now buy into these green neighborhoods, these green-lined neighborhoods. Urban planning plays out very differently in the US and the UK. So a week or two ago, we got a report by Dr. Tony Sewell saying that Britain has no structural racism. We know that's not true, but the US has built structural racism into the urban planning system. The tools of zoning, of covenanting, etc., are deeply flawed and have been used for racist reasons. The UK, to my knowledge, doesn't have racism built into the planning system, but because the UK is structurally racist, urban planning will maintain those structures. Now, I just want to give you an example from 20 years ago. Friends of the Earth did a report and they called it pollution injustice. They didn't want to call it environmental injustice because they felt that the situation regards race was different in the US. But what the Friends of the Earth did was they looked at 30 of the most polluting power plants in the UK, and lo and behold, they're largely in low-income neighborhoods. But they didn't go down, they didn't disaggregate to race, because it's very difficult to do that in the UK when you've not got a zoning system where you can say that neighborhood is 90% black. Now, you do have these neighborhoods, and I've spoken to people in Bristol, and we're doing some links between Boston and Bristol. You do get these neighborhoods, but that's not because of zoning, that's because of historical factors, racist housing policies. Yes, they exist. So I think there are elements of the system in the UK that have been used for racist means, but in the US, the whole of urban planning has been built on the maintenance of white supremacy. And I don't think you can quite say that in the UK, although there is talk now about zoning being used in the UK system as well. That's something you in environmental law might want to look into. And I think the government has commissioned several reports on doing it, because it's a much quicker system, because it's an as of right system. Okay, this is this zone, you do this, come to code, and you get to do it. You don't have to go through planning permission and things like that, as long as you build to code. Right. So green gentrification plays out very differently, I think, in the UK, but in the US, I mean, in many ways, what we are thinking now is not only is it end stage neoliberalism, it's end stage settler colonialism, and it is whitening neighborhoods. And it's being seen as okay because these are sustainable neighborhoods, and sustainability, is seen as that great goal. We need to keep problematizing sustainability, especially when it is enrolled by neoliberalism, to do things, and we know what those effects are, in the name of sustainability.
Brilliant. Consolata, I want you to take this next question, actually. What do you hope the environmental justice movement takes away from the BLM movement and racially disparate impact of the pandemic going forward? You're on mute.
Here I am. So in terms of what the environmental justice movement can take from the BLM movement, honestly, I simply think that the way forward in this is bringing people and at the forefront of the environmental justice movement that are people of color, and bringing this and making this connection between the systems a bit stronger. So by that, I mean passing the mic, sharing expertise, using your platforms. For example, Sir David Attenborough could absolutely do a collaboration with one of the there's so many climate activists right now. You know what I mean? Like, you know,
David Attenborough's a sore point for me too.
it's true. Like, look at the following, look at the engagement. The thing is, I even had this conversation another day in a session with some other friends, and we're speaking about the whole idea of really making sure that whoever has a platform, whoever has something to say, you know, let me say it. And if you're an ally in that sense, if you actually want to a better environment for everybody, the amount of following you have will absolutely bring light and shed light to actually what is happening in MAPA countries, in the global South. So definitely, you know, using the privilege, especially in this case that you have, and using, again, the whole idea of, if we have to talk about white supremacies, it's more likely that a white man is going to listen to another white man, because, you know, they can kind of like identify themselves there. So in terms of, you know, the two movements are definitely, you know, Black Lives Matter movement is a cross-sector movement. So there is engagement everywhere. And definitely the environmental justice could absolutely do the same. And, you know, really remembering the idea, and especially this is really evident and apparent in the Black Lives Matter movement. The whole, there are so many different actors that bring about social change, and all are valuable actors. Whether there was this chart the other day in which they were like, you know, visionaries, disruptors, builders, activists, artists, organizers, frontline respondents. Everybody has their role, and that's why it's so important to really integrate all these systems to bring about equity, liberation, inclusion, resilience, you know, all these things that we are talking about in terms of climate justice, of environmental justice. So definitely pass the mic and use your privilege in a way that is, you know, benefits everybody.
That's great. Yeah. So also, Gita, you've got a question. You've just mentioned the difficulties of irrationality in judicial reviews. Now that environmental justice is being more closely aligned with human rights, do you think proportionality review will begin to be applied more often?
So this is just about the fact that with human rights, the standard is less. Was it MAD, or did you take the right amount of action? So it's a slightly less hard standard to meet. And it's a very sort of UK specific question. So when I was looking at it, and it may have changed, I haven't done so much close UK casework recently, but by the time you breached a human rights norm, you'd already breached a whole load of environmental laws. So it didn't actually, you know, the way that human rights works is that it does breach environmental harm, does breach human rights, but it has to reach quite a high standard. And there's already quite a lot of detailed environmental law which sets out processes or things that need to happen. So it's always a brilliant thing to be able to add in when you can and make the arguments and make the linkages. And I think that's always what lawyers try to do if they're working in the justice field. But quite often I found that it didn't take things necessarily that much further a lot of the time, so we always used to try and argue it where we could.
Got it. Okay, and then a question for Anita, if you want to take this one. What effects do you think the police, crime, sentencing and courts bills provisions regarding protests could have on young people's climate activism? It's a big question for right now.
Yeah, this is actually quite an interesting question, because I work with my local youth strike climate group and also Fridays for Future Digital. And we've had these discussions looking at what this bill means for our activism. Obviously, because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to have our in-person strikes for a while now, but this bill kind of intensifies it. When we looked at our actual strikes and how they're run and how we work, we technically wouldn't be able to actually protest under these new provisions, which is really weird. It's so weird to have our rights that we've been so like used to just stripped just like that. Of course, there's a lot of anger in the youth climate strike movement towards this, because personally I feel like protests should disrupt. If they weren't disrupting, then what would be the point of having them? If you could walk past a protest and feel nothing and go straight back to normal, then what change would that protest bring? I think this bill just infringes the rights of not just the youth climate strikers, but all the protesters who protest for various reasons. And I feel like because I'm so used to protesting and using protests as a way of having my voice heard, it kind of hits home. And I was like, oh, that's really weird that I wouldn't be able to do this. My friends wouldn't be able to do this. And really, it speaks of the government. What if they're not allowing us to protest? What are they actually going to do? What is the alternative? What are they putting in place? Which obviously is nothing. And it's how do we ensure that we have a democracy if we aren't allowed to protest in a way that actually brings about change? It threatens our very democracy. And I think it's really important that people start to look at this bill for what it is. I think it's been very sugarcoated in the media, and it's made to seem like it's not a big deal, protests can still go on. But when you look at the writing and what protests look like now, or what are meant to look like with this new bill, you realize that it infringes a lot of rights and it's unfair. And hopefully there is some change. There's been a lot of campaigning around it. And I think it's important that these campaigns are happening to show that people are listening, people are watching this current government. Nobody's just going to take it lying down. And hopefully there will be some changes.
Yes, hopefully. I'm going to pose this question to anyone that wants to take it, actually. So this one is about ESG, which is definitely an upcoming discussion topic for many companies and organizations. ESG stands for environmental, social governance. But can the race to meet ESG goals be detrimental to achieving genuine change? What do we think of that?
So I can start, and I'm sure others will have ideas and responses. So I think this speaks to the overall concern about greenwashing that's rising up with net zero as well. You're seeing a lot of organizations that they're just finding ways to kind of carry on business as usual and make it look like they're doing something, which is really problematic. And also the overriding thing for companies is that their legal duties still center around making profit, which is entirely at odds with a whole load of other things like environmental protection and human rights. Or can be, and depending on their model, if they extract fossil fuels or something like that. So as long as that is the core way in which companies are legally managed, ESG is not going to help very far, because it's sort of nice to have where they can do some window dressing or even some potentially useful things. But if their core business model is destroying the planet or destroying people, it's not really going to quite do the job.
Consolata, do you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I mean, I definitely echo what Gita was sharing. And again, going back to the whole idea of, corporate social responsibility and, responsibility that companies hold even within supply chains, and the whole idea of having all these multinational corporations and not knowing who to, assign responsibility to. And that's where I think, national law, especially Western national law, play a very important role in bringing about the rules and the structure for companies to operate, even operating in other countries. So, the whole idea of due diligence, of duty of care in the operations of subsidiaries of multinational corporations. And it is absolutely really important when you go and address, the environmental and social aspect of, companies governing their operation. So governing the operation. So yeah, no, I mean, it's important to make sure that these do not go and the decisions of company are actually real steps towards safeguarding the rights of humans and the rights of the environment they operate in. And so definitely it would be useless to go about, a change without making sure that these rules are really enforced on a national level before, going internationally.
Yeah. We've gone over time, I think, by 10 minutes. So thank you to anyone who's still here. I'm going to actually wrap up with one last question that was posed from an audience member on how we can uplift and platform people from Global South in particular, since they're hit by the climate crisis the hardest. And I'll start with that actually, because of the work that we're doing on my show. It is hugely problematic that the media doesn't cover the Global South voices nearly enough. I can see that happening in the UK as well. We don't see people of colour represented in media there too. I, for one, am working on that also. But certainly, I've spoken to tens of people at this point through the show who are doing phenomenal work on the ground. And they are providing the most holistic solutions possible, hands down. It's just literally a case of being able to give them those platforms. And I didn't know anything about the climate crisis when I started working on the show, in full transparency. And I feel less guilty about that because I realized that Mary Robinson, who I co-hosted with, also did not know a great deal about climate change either, certainly throughout her term as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and she feels enormous guilt around it. But we all arrive to it when we do. But I think the biggest issue for me is that I thought that climate change was a white people's issue because of these narratives. And the work that I'm doing certainly is about trying to overlay racial justice issues, gender rights, intersectional feminism on top of climate, and to help us try and create culture around that. Instead of thinking about it as this isolated thing that like environmentalists and hippies do, because it's just not true. But if anyone else wants to follow up on that too, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I think we actually do have time for one more question, so we'll get that into.
Just a few thoughts on that question. I think it's particularly important that we have spaces where Black and Indigenous people of colour feel comfortable to speak. It's one thing to have the spaces, but are they comfortable to speak in those spaces? Black Girl Environmentalist, an amazing organisation. They did the whole pass the mic taking up space, and they worked with amazing influencers and like people who are big to ensure that particularly Black girls who are in the environmental space had the chance and the opportunity to kind of speak their truth and speak about these issues to a lot wider audience than their usual platform. And I think work like this is really important when looking at ensuring that people from the Global South and Black and Indigenous people of colour have a platform to speak on, because sometimes your own platform isn't enough. And ensuring that people are willing to give other people a platform, particularly white people, is really important, because them showing that they are listening and they are willing to listen allows their people on their platform to say, well, maybe I should listen too. I think another part of this is looking at, of course, David Attenborough. It was really ironic because there was a whole campaign about Pass the Mic asking Sir David Attenborough, who has now deactivated his Instagram, to at least give it to the young people in the Global South who are doing amazing work looking at the climate crisis and how to solve it, at least giving them some space to speak and speak their truth, which I was in full support of. And I think things like that are really important, because especially when we look at the documentaries that have been coming out recently around the climate crisis, they've been really whitewashed and really greenwashed in their solutions that they give at the end. And I think because of the lack of representation of the Global South in these documentaries and their opinions, it's why we're seeing these whitewashed, greenwashed solutions that don't actually help the way they intend to. So that's why I think it's important that we build those spaces that Black, Indigenous people of colour and the Global South, the most affected people, feel comfortable on and are feeling that they can speak is really important to ensure that we have a wider range. And also touching on the whole the climate crisis is for white people, and that whole type of aspect, looking at it, I was working with learning through landscapes, who actually look at making sure that more Black people of colour in primary schools actually get to go out and see the green spaces in the UK and build that relationship with nature, because it's really weird how alienated that I've seen Black people are from the countryside and green spaces, and it's so completely different to our ancestral kind of beginnings. And even, at least for me, my motherland, I'm Nigerian, so like when I go back home, I'm so used to being around nature, and it's weird, like when I come here, I'm like, why do I feel weirded around nature? I think it's really important to ensure that we are building those relationships with nature, that everyone is, especially the lower classes and the people of colour. It really helps when trying to immerse them into the conversation around the climate crisis, because they already have that relationship. And I think that's really important.
That's a great way to summarize it. Consolata, how do you want to wrap it up? You're on mute still.
I mean, yeah, I'm back. I absolutely agree with what Anita said. You know, the whole idea that we are nature, and our system, our physical system, our organism is nature, and the nature around us, and how these really come together and come across. And, the whole aspect of, once we start getting in contact with nature, once we start doing this inward looking journey, we start understanding why it's so important that we have these the spaces, the time, how many people now have just appreciate every day even more, going for a walk and just, spending some time and seeing the rooting and the grounding energy that nature has in our well-being, in our spiritual well-being, physical, mental, and all of it. So there's really a high interdependence between nature and the environment and us. So that's why I keep saying the sooner we rewild this nature. And rewilding nature means simply going back to where we've come from, in a way of where our ancestors from. Yes, the white man did say come to bring civilization, but we were absolutely civilized before that. Just understanding that the perspective of nature, of approaching nature, of life, of freedom, of liberty is very much different based on the context. And it's absolutely not fair, and it's an absolutely skewed narrative, the one that sees, the Western understanding. That is absolutely not the case. So really bringing people to get closer to their nature, and to get closer to nature, in order for us to start treasuring what we really have around, would be how I'd like to conclude. Yeah.
Yes, I'm really big into rewilding cities too, so I don't want to forget about cities. I'm well into like making meadows out of Brooklyn streets, like 100%. Gita, how do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I think I really agree with what Consolata was saying, that remaking this connection between ourselves and the integration of it, the openness to seeing different ways of looking at things. There is a climate emergency, as lots of people say, but that doesn't mean that we pull out ready-made solutions. We really take that time to engage and understand what went wrong and how it went wrong. And from there, we proceed together. I think that would be the core thing I would say.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so thank you so much. We lost Julian a few minutes ago, but I wanted to say thank you to each of you, to Gita, to Anita, for Consolata's work as well. I'm going to wrap it up with one statement from an audience member, very kind comment from Katie, who said, some comments rather than questions. I wanted to echo what's been said already about how fantastic it is to see a panel comprised solely of people of colour, other than at events organised by POC organisations and associations. I've never seen this before. And I also want to thank all the speakers for their excellent talks, and to the chair for moderating so well, and the speakers, bringing all the speakers in to participate in the discussion again. This is not something that happens all the time. So Thank you so much. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I'm going to hand it back over to Ileana. Thank you so much for having me. We'll see you soon.